And I'm so thrilled to be here with you all today. Now, before we dive into all things cross-cultural communications, I actually want to start off with a really quick story. So, when I was 14 years old, my family decided to move all of us from the San Francisco Bay Area all the way over to Shanghai, China. Because at the time, my father was just starting his own business and he wanted to have an office overseas. So he wanted all of us to move there. One of the first things he did, though, was enroll me into an international school. And it was at this international school that I started to see that there was such a diversity in how people thought, how people engaged, and how they communicated. And this is the cross-cultural communications that I want to talk about today, because I have discovered when we can broaden our cultural awareness, understand that there are multiple ways in how people get things done and how they communicate with each other, I believe we can better collaborate, be more creative, and of course, drive better business results. Which is why today I've divided my time with you all into two parts. The first part is we're going to talk all things culture. Now, when I say those words, I'm sure there are certain things that come to mind, certain key words, and we're going to talk about all of that, but we're going to dive deeper. The second part of my talk is we're going to talk about communications. So I'm going to be teaching you things like, what can you say? How can you say it so people listen? Now, my hope is at the end of my 45-minute talk, everybody here is going to walk away with, number one, you're going to know exactly how to become that better communicator in the workplace. Meaning, when you share an idea, when you're advocating for yourself, people are going to pay attention. My second hope is that everybody here is going to be able to know how to achieve that better workplace result. So in many ways, I'm going to be taking you on a journey. And to really sum up my goal, it's this. I want you to be able to understand that if you want to accelerate your career, you have to see that your perception, our perception of the world is different. And that's actually a beautiful thing. And it's something that we should use as a guide so we can better engage with other people. So this is just a high-level summary of what I hope all of us can walk away with today. Now, as Michael mentioned, I started off in news. I was a television reporter, and I was in that industry for about 10 years. And you can see some of the pictures up here. That was when I was working at the ABC station. And when I was at ABC, it was actually where I won an Emmy-Award. And it's funny because in the news industry, that's actually what we consider the most prestigious award. And after I won that award, all of my colleagues and my friends, they were like, well, you got this. Like, where do you want to go? Where do you want to work? You can essentially go anywhere and do anything. But instead of me continuing on, I actually decided to leave. And I started my own company, which is Soulcast Media, and we do all things communications. And one of the reasons why I decided to do that was because early on, when I started working on television, communications was actually not something I was good at. Now, part of it is personality. I consider myself fairly shy and introverted, so honestly, standing up here today, there was a lot of practice that was involved. But part of it was also cultural. You know, growing up, I was actually never really taught to speak up. I was never taught to put myself out there and communicate. In fact, I was actually taught the opposite. So as you can imagine, when I started working, and I was working in a very extroverted industry where you really have to get yourself out there. You got to communicate. You have to be good at public speaking. It was a really sharp learning curve. But after several years, I decided that there was so much that I learned in that industry that I can now teach it to folks. Because what I had experienced early on was very much this. It was this communications friction. And some of you might resonate with this because sometimes we experience this from time to time where we'll say something, we'll ask for something, we'll want to talk about this exciting thing or even suggest a new project, so our intentions are right, but for some reason when we say it, when we raise our hand, when we pitch that idea, it was maybe misinterpreted. There were some miscommunications. Has anyone ever felt that before in the workplace? Yeah, I think it happens from time to time where your intentions doesn't match how you hoped people would perceive it. So after some time, I decided to go, wait a second, like what's going on here? Because I knew it was actually more than just this communications friction. It was something deeper. And that's when I realized actually this one thing, that my assumptions are not necessarily the assumptions of others. In fact, we have to rethink how we go about showing up in the workplace. So what did I do? Well, fortunately, as a journalist, I'm just naturally very curious. So I started asking questions like, why did I think these things? And what I realized, and this wasn't something that happened instantly, it took time, but I realized this one thing. It's that cultural context affects our communications. Because you remember early on when I said that communications was not something that I was good at early on, and part of it, yes, it was personality, but part of it was cultural. That's what I discovered. And I discovered that when we can understand cultural context, it can make us better communicators ourselves, but it can also allow us to better understand our colleagues, our clients, so that we have a broader perspective. So this is what I want to be talking about today, and this is what I want to share. You know, when we have that understanding of the power of cultural context, we can go from feeling this way. Maybe right now you're thinking, oh, sometimes I feel stuck at work, meaning I know I want to say something, but I'm not really sure, should I say it? How should I say it? Or maybe we go in thinking, well, what if they do think that about me? What if it's too much? What if it's not really what I think I should do? It's these assumptions, right? Or maybe it's that miscommunications where you're like, wait, I did say something, but why was it perceived completely differently? Because, and once we have this cultural understanding, I believe we can go to this, from stuck to unstuck. From questioning whether you should or shouldn't, you'll now have an understanding of what you should do. And all those assumptions of, I think this might be, or I think this would happen, you're gonna now have that broader perspective. And all that miscommunications that sometimes we experience, you'll now have that clarity of, this is what I want to say, and this is how I'm going to say it. This is what I've discovered is the power of having that cultural understanding. So let's start with part one, which is going to be all about culture. So this is my first question. What is culture? Now, every time I get to this point, a lot of people go, well, it's when I'm going to get on a plane and I'm going to fly to Italy with my parents, my kids, my family, and we're going to eat some delicious pasta, drink some delicious wine, and see the sights. Yes, that is culture in many ways. It's the arts, it's the food, it's like the rituals and the traditions of that culture. Absolutely. But the culture that I want to talk about today is actually deeper. I want us to explore how cultural influences affect us, our communications, and the way we show up at work. Because many of us might not think of culture this way, which is why I'm so thrilled to be here with you all, because I want you to be able to think a bit deeper of, why do I show up this way? Why do I tend to communicate this way? But not only that, why do my colleagues do this? I'm going to go through each of these four with you, and I want you to see that as we go through these four, you will see how these all play into how you might engage, communicate, and collaborate with people. These are the four. The first one is personality. The second one is nationality and ethnicity. The third one is generations. And the fourth one is home environment. Now, of the four, I would say the fourth one is actually what I specialize in. But each one of these, as we dive into this, you'll be able to see how, yeah, I can see how part of this makes me show up the way I do. Because sometimes people say, well, it's just the way I am, right? People might say it and respond that way. But again, I think it's actually much deeper as to why. Now, before I dive into that, I want to be crystal clear that everything I'm about to share, I am going to be speaking generally. But there are certainly a lot of nuances of the four categories I'm going to be talking about. And nothing that I'm saying is like absolute black and white. In fact, there's a lot of gray in between. But I do believe seeing these 4 all laid out can give us that holistic view of the diversity in communication. So let's start with personality, and I want to do a really quick poll here. So this is the first question, and we're just going to do a simple raise of hand. So the first question is this: do you feel more yourself when A, you're at the center of attention, or B, you're in the background? Who here is A? You feel more yourself when you're the center of attention. Okay, yeah, I love that. Who here is B? I like to be in the background. Oh my gosh, I feel there's no right or wrong answer here. It's just what you naturally gravitate towards, which is great. I hear some of you are like, yeah. Okay, here's my second question. The second question is this one. You tend to find talking to new people either A, awkward, or B, energizing. Who here is A for awkward? All right, I see you. Who here is B, energizing? You must all be in sales. I'm kidding. Okay, so the reason why I asked this question, of course, is just kind of a funny, silly poll, but it really is to really talk about this when it comes to personality, and you're going to resonate with this when you see it. It's actually what we know. It's the difference between extroverts and introverts. Now, instinctively, just seeing this on the screen, you might be like, absolutely, I'm an extrovert, or I'm an introvert, or I know there's that middle, the ambivert, right? So let me just talk about these in a bit more detail, because I do think having this and laying it out is part of having that cultural understanding. So we all know what the difference between extroverts and introverts are. It really comes down to how do you get your energy? It's the social stimulation. So for my extroverted folks here, you generally love being around people. You feel energized being around people. Being in a group, not a problem. You love it, you get your energy from that. And when it comes to communicating, you like to think out loud. So you actually might say things like, I'm thinking out loud here. And speaking up first in a group setting is probably not something that you struggle with. You just kind of go and you just say what's on your mind. However, for my introverted folks, and this is for me, I tend to prefer just that time to quietly recharge. I have that, time of reflection, just to kind of sit back. I prefer one-on-one engagements as well and smaller meetings. And when I do communicate, I tend to notice that I like to just kind of think about it before I say it. And I usually like to kind of listen and observe. So again, I'm more introverted, and when you look at this, of course, I think you're thinking, oh yeah, I'm one or the other. But the point of me talking about this and personality is understanding this, that this is part of the cultural context I'm talking about. Because even though you might have your own preferences and ease in how you communicate in the workplace, those on your team, internally or externally, they might resonate with one more than the other. So the key here is not to assume that there's only one right way to do things. It's that there are actually many ways in why people show up the way they do, and personality absolutely is one of those considerations. The second one is nationality and ethnicity. Now, the difference between the two is nationality is essentially like, where is your passport, right? Which country issued your passport? Ethnicity, on the other hand, is basically where are your ancestors from. So nationality, I'm American, but ethnically, I'm Chinese. So I'm gonna show you a picture, because this picture is gonna just be kind of like a little quiz. And when you look at this picture, which I'm gonna show you, I want you just to think about what is it that you see. I'm gonna give you a few seconds to observe it, and I'm gonna talk about it. This is the picture. So just in your mind, just look at this and just observe, like, what is it that you see? So, what's interesting about this picture is there's two sociologists, Richard Nisbett and Takahiko Masudo, and they did a fascinating study where they found, depending on your culture, nationality or ethnicity, you actually tended to focus on different aspects of the picture. They found that Westerners, when they saw that picture of the fish, they immediately looked at the larger moving fish at the front and center of the picture. But when they polled folks who were of Eastern descent, they noticed that the response that those folks gave them were, they talked more about the whole picture. And the way they described it was the background, the relationships between the objects, and like maybe how the fish, the kelp, the frog on the bottom. So they found this very interesting because both are right. It's just one's perception is their reality. Now, it wasn't just to see like what's the difference between these two cultures. They actually wanted to understand why. And they discovered Westerners tend to look at the larger moving fish because in society, and we can see this in Western society, there's so much of this emphasis of individualism and autonomy where you go out, you carve your own path, like you can do it, right? It gives you that confidence that you can go out. But in Eastern culture, like in Asian culture, for example, I know a lot of times it's like that collectivist thinking, which is why those folks looked at the whole picture and the relationship between the two. Now, I share this with you because, again, there's no one right or wrong. It's just understanding that different cultures, they see things a little bit differently. Now, one of the other things I want to talk about when it comes to this is we know in sociology that there's a difference between high context cultures and low context cultures. Now, what this means is depending on the culture that you gravitate towards, there's actually a certain communication style you might gravitate towards. So starting with low context cultures, if you grew up or you're influenced by a low context culture, you will notice that a lot of communications tends to be more explicit. Communication is more precise, and messages generally are more simple and clear and to the point. Now, one of the analogies that people always say is you can tell you're in a low context culture when there's things like memos being written, pamphlets being made, because people want to know exactly what needs to be done and how it needs to be done. But on the flip side, there is such a thing as a high context culture. And if you grew up in a high context culture or you're influenced by it, you'll notice communications tends to be a little bit different. Instead of being explicit, communications tends to be more implicit. It's more nuanced and inferred. So when somebody says something, there might be more layered and it's more sophisticated, and you have more of that like unspoken understanding of, oh, this is how things are supposed to be done. There's another analogy that somebody was sharing with me once, which is they said, if you're married and you're like a newlywed and you've been married for maybe like 1, 2, or 3 years, you gotta be more low context. You gotta be explicit. But if you've been married for, let's say, 30, 40, 50 years, maybe you can be more high context because just by, the way your partner looks, just by the way maybe what they were doing with their body, you know exactly how they're feeling. That's the difference. Now, at this point, every time I talk about low and high context, I always get this inevitable question. Well, Jessica, which countries actually fall where? Like, now I want to know. So I'm going to show you a graph. And on this graph, you're going to see where certain countries fall depending on whether they're low context or high context. You can see countries like the US, Australia, Canada tends to fall really in the low context side. But if you go towards the right, high context, you'll see countries like Japan, Korea, Indonesia, China, Saudi Arabia, they tend to be more high context, which again is more implicit communications. Now, I show you this, again, this is a general understanding of where these countries fall. Of course, there's a lot of nuances, but the reason why I show this to you is because I want you to be able to see how there really is a difference in how certain cultures, certain countries communicate. And Erin Myers, she wrote the book, The Culture Map, and this is actually her graph based on her study and what she found. And she actually said that it's understandable why these countries fall this way. Because if you look at countries like US, Australia, Canada, there's a lot of diversity in that country, a lot of immigrants who come into these countries, so therefore communications it does have to be more explicit. Otherwise, there would be a lot of confusion of like, what is it exactly that you mean? But if you look at these countries, who are on the high context, there isn't as much diversity, so there's more of that understanding of how people communicate with each other. Which is to say, when we look at this, where these countries fall, it's not that one is better than the other. It's certainly not like that, but I do feel when you have this understanding and when you think about the people you work with, maybe the clients you want to approach, having this understanding of, do they tend to communicate more explicitly or implicitly? Are they engaged or disengaged because they communicate that way? Instead of jumping to conclusions and assuming that maybe they don't care, but maybe they do care, it's understanding this. Again, cultural context absolutely affects our communications, including how other people, like our colleagues, might communicate too. The third one is generations. So right now, we are working amongst, 6 generations. From the top, we have the silent generation all the way down to the generation alpha. Now, I was talking to one of my friends recently, and he was sharing with me, he sits in generation X. And he says that anytime he has something that he wants to, pitch or an idea that he wants to talk about with somebody who's in the baby boomer generation, he notices that they always want to get on the phone. They always want to talk it out. They want to have this really deep discussion so they can understand what is going on. But when he's now talking to folks on his team who are maybe millennials, he notices that millennials, and I'm a millennial, they have a lot of questions. A lot of like, why are we doing this? Is this productive? How can we make it more efficient? So when he tailors his communications, he has to be prepared to answer all the questions. But when he's talking to Generation Z, he gets a lot of like, can you just tell me this over Slack? Can you just shoot me a text message? It's a funny story, but again, generalizing, but it's really understanding that what I appreciate about my friend is he understands that, again, certain generations have preferences for how they communicate. Now, what I want to dive deeper in terms of why this is, part of it, half of it, is personal. So it's just things like, how you were raised in terms of maybe your family, your teachers, unique personal experiences that formed your communication style. But simultaneously, it's also social. So what's happening in society at the time that you were born that might affect your understanding of communication? So the economy, what's the political climate at the time? Trends, news, even the technology being used. Now, the key here is just having this understanding can allow us to see that each generation has its own unique characteristics. And again, this cultural context can allow us to better understand ourselves, including why other people on our team might communicate the way they do. And then finally, home environment. This is the fourth cultural context I want to talk about. And like I said, of the 4, this is the one that I specialize in. I have a book coming out actually this summer where I talk about all things quiet culture and loud culture. And what I mean about home environment is, have you ever thought about the way you were raised? Maybe what your parents, grandparents, your caregivers, whoever raised you, what were some of the things that they taught you or told you that actually you internalized and is a part of you today? And I've actually discovered that there's such a thing as quiet culture traits and loud culture traits. Now, I'm going to dive into these things, but there's actually 4 categories. So when you think about how you were raised, your home environment, what were some of the things that maybe your caregivers taught you about how do you engage with people? How should you spend your time? When something amazing happens to you, maybe at school and at work, how do you talk about it? And if there's conflict, how should you manage it? So in a quiet culture, and this is the one that I was raised in, I was actually taught these principles. It's actually better to listen more than speak. If you are working, you should have this mentality of just, put your head down and just work hard. When it comes to showcasing your wins, instead of talking about it, it's better to be humble about it and be modest. And when it comes to managing conflict, well, you just should avoid it to maintain a harmonious environment. This is what I actually call quiet culture traits. But I have colleagues who very much resonate with the opposite, which is loud culture traits, where they were taught at home, you gotta speak up. You gotta speak up and do it with conviction. You should go out, prioritize socializing, making friends, and building those connections. And when it comes to talking about the things that you do well, it's not about being modest, but you want to talk about it and showcase your wins frequently. And if there is conflict, it's not about shying away from conflict, it's actually knowing how to address it properly. What I find fascinating about quiet and loud culture is, again, there's no right or wrong, it's just like how we were raised. But the reason why I point this out is very much in how we were taught in our early years, it does absolutely affect our communications. Both are equally valued, both form the person that we are, and I think it's important to talk about because when we look at maybe folks on our team, maybe there tends to be folks who maybe are more quiet, maybe because they were raised in a quiet culture, but it doesn't mean that they're less engaged or they don't care. So instead of jumping to conclusions and assuming, we can now think, wait a second, what are the bigger forces at play here? So right now, we talked about the 4 cultural contexts. We talked about personality, we talked about nationality and ethnicity, we talked about generation, and we also talked about home environment. I believe when we look at a person, it's important that we consider these 4 areas because instead of thinking like, oh, it has to be done this way, or this is what I know, so this must be the way things should be, it's actually thinking, wait, there are so many other influences at play. So that saying of, oh, I am just the way I am, yes, but think about all the reasons why you are the way you are, including why others may be the way. And I believe having this cultural context can lead to better collaboration and honestly, more creativity. So let's start with part 2, which is all about communications now. So the question now is, how can we communicate better? I think all of us are like, yeah, I would love to communicate better. Whether you're like, I'm pretty good, or I'm like, I really could use some help. I think all of us can improve communications, including myself. There's so much to learn. Now, in order for us to talk about communications, I think we have to talk about these 2 things, respect and trust. Because yes, I can stand here and I can talk with you all about how do you reduce those filler words? What do you do with your body? What do you do with your tone of voice? But I really think if we want people to listen, we have to talk about how do you build and get that respect and how do you build trust? And this is what is the part of communications that I think is very important because when we talk about communications, we have to see that when people trust you, they respect you, they are more willing to listen to you and vice versa, which is why I actually want to talk about respect and trust. In fact, what's pretty neat about this is, so James Kouzes and Barry Posner, they wrote this book called Credibility. That's actually the title of this book. And they actually found that when you have respect and trust, automatically that equals building credibility. It makes sense though, right? Credibility is when you feel this way about a certain person. So then the question is, what do we do? How do we do it? And I think this is actually something that we can actually think about deeper. So when it comes to respect, I want you to think about these 2 things. How can you demonstrate character-driven attributes and expertise-driven attributes? Because right now, when you hear those words, respect, maybe we don't really think about like what actually goes into it. But based on this study, they found if you can demonstrate these 2 things, people will tend to respect your judgment and they'll listen. So the question is, how do you demonstrate these 2 things? And what are the differences between the 2? So character-driven attributes are things like the things you do, the things you show. Do you mean what you say? If you're gonna say something, are you gonna follow through with it? And are people going to be able to rely on you for it? Those are character-driven attributes. It's also things like having empathy. I say character-driven attributes, a lot of times, it's like that feeling you get from somebody, right? You're like, oh, I really like this person. I think a lot of times it's that character-driven attribute that we're feeling. But at the other end of it, it's the expertise-driven. The difference between that is this. A lot of it's actually communications. It's, do you know your stuff? Can you communicate what you know clearly and concisely? Are you able to articulate how you plan and how you will solve that problem? And do you have that knowledge to back up what you say? This is what we call expertise-driven attributes, and you can see the difference between the two, but the key here is you actually need to demonstrate both. Now, because we're talking about communications, I want to share a little bit more about like what can you actually do to demonstrate the expertise-driven attributes. So there are really three things to think about here. Number one, I cannot think of a better way to show your expertise than truly giving presentations. Now, I know many of you are like, that's the last thing I want to do. I hate giving presentations, and I get it. You know, a lot of us just are not very comfortable with it. But I truly feel like if you can do and give presentations and even volunteer to maybe do a quick 5-10 minute presentation with your team, that is a great way for people to start to view you as an expert. The reason why is because it's one of the best ways to reach the most amount of people in the shortest amount of time. And people are actually then paying attention to you. So this is where I actually want to share one of my communications tips that I teach. So for those of you who get nervous public speaking and doing presentations, the way I generally coach folks is I always say, if you're standing here and you're doing a big presentation, or not, maybe just to 5 or 10 people, instead of seeing it as I'm giving a presentation, I want you to think, I'm actually just having a conversation. I'm having a conversation with every single person in this room. And not just that, I'm not giving a presentation to 10, 20, 500 people. I'm just having a conversation with Jennifer. I'm having a conversation with Sam. I think if you can adopt that mentality to giving presentations, it really humanizes the experience. The second thing is finding opportunities to share industry news and trends. So I know all of us here, we work hard and we're doing work day in and day out. And even though you know you're doing good work, do other people know it? Because I believe part of being seen as an expert is being able to find those opportunities to talk about it. You cannot always expect people to be like, oh, hey, Jessica, like, you know, what are your thoughts on this? People are busy too, right? You have to find and carve out those opportunities for yourself. So it can be as simple as, you know, just sharing like what you know, what you've been doing. But again, this is actually part of being able to advocate for yourself because you can't always assume people are going to ask you. The third is making small talk. And one of the things about making small talk is like, oh yeah, you know, I mean, talking about the weather. No, not necessarily. Making small talk, and the key, and this is why I'm talking about it, is I believe when you can make small talk beyond just like the formalities of the weather, the weekend, you know, that kind of stuff, I think building small talk can help you build rapport. Because what I have found is when people know you, they like you, they are more willing to bat for you. And that is the power of making small talk. So instead of, you know, maybe feeling intimidated by folks like, oh my gosh, that's like the senior VP or whatever, just get to know people. Because again, when people know you, that's how they can keep you top of mind. So those are some things that I want you to think about. The next thing is let's talk about trust. So when we think about trust, it's actually something we can build proactively. And it's really two things. It's making sure that you're being transparent and proactive. You can see I'm talking about being proactive a lot when it comes to communications because that is absolutely so important. So the question is, how should you think about this? So transparency and proactiveness is really thinking about, okay, if there's a problem at work, because you know, it's not always so smooth sailing. If there's a problem at work, how can we make sure that we don't default to solving things alone? Now, I will say, you know, as somebody who was born and raised in a quiet culture, you know, dealing with conflict, I usually would like try to solve things by myself because I was like, oh, I don't want to like bother somebody, or I would jump to these conclusions. But I realized that, you know, when we do encounter problems, it's better to do it together because here's the thing about working in corporate, no one likes to be caught off guard. When somebody is caught off guard, it makes them feel unprepared. So instead of assuming the worst, like, oh, if I talk to my manager about this, are they gonna think this about me? Don't think about that. Instead, think about it's better to talk things out together and solve problems together. Now, inevitably, whenever I get to this part, people always ask, makes sense, Jessica? Easy to do when things are, going well, but what if things are really going bad? Like, how do I communicate during difficult situations? So there's actually a framework that I love sharing with people, and this is actually in the book that I have, and I call it the tact framework. And it's a way of framing your communications whenever you have to talk about something that might be a bit tricky. So I'm gonna go over what the tact framework is. And feel free to write this down. This is a way of structuring your communications. So the beauty of the tact framework is it actually stands for tact. So it's very easy to remember. So starting with the T, if something is happening at work and you're like, oh my God, this is not good, I want you to first turn your thinking around. Instead of assuming the worst is going to happen, think about, wait a second, it might not be that bad, let me try to approach it proactively. A is now, when you do communicate, perhaps with your manager, how can you articulate the process? This means explaining what happened, what went wrong? When did things maybe go wrong? Because I feel people are better able to help you solve your problems when they have context. And they can get context when you can articulate what happened. The C is now you want to communicate solutions. So I always feel that when it comes to communicating problems, people want to talk about it, but they also want to see that you have been able to think about some solutions. Because I know a lot of managers, it's all about, well, let's talk about this, but what are some of the ideas that you have? And I feel like that proactiveness is you showing that you've thought about it. Communicate solutions. And then finally, talk it out together. This is, of course, a simple one where it's like now it's a conversation, now it's a dialogue. What do you think? How do you think we should approach this? The tact framework is a simple way to structure your communications if you ever feel nervous or anxious that you have to engage in this kind of communication. That's what it is. So, we went on a journey. We talked about all things cross-cultural communications. And you now have what I believe a 360-degree view of understanding cultural context and how it affects communications. Because what I talked about today is understanding that how a person shows up, how you show up, and how your colleague shows up, how your potential clients prefer to communicate. A lot of it is influenced by cultural context, which is why we started by talking about culture. So I shared with you all things about, yes, culture is like the arts, the foods, the rituals, the traditions, right? But it's also much more than that. It's how does our personality, our nationality, ethnicity, the generation we were born into, and even the home environment, how we were raised, how does that affect our communications, including our colleagues' communications? And instead of assuming that this is the one right way to do it, how can we think about, maybe there's other factors at play? It's really knowing that cultural context affects communications. And that is where we talked about communications next. And really what I was talking about is like, how can we think about building credibility in the workplace, which is these two things, right? It's respect and trust. And if we think about how do we demonstrate these things, it's like, okay, how can we show character-driven attributes? How can we showcase expertise-driven attributes? Trust, having transparency and proactiveness, and finally, thinking about applying the tact framework if you ever find yourself dealing with a tricky situation. So this is how I would like to end my talk, and it's really just understanding this. If you want to do great work, you want to build credibility, and you want to communicate with tact, you gotta consider cultural context, because that can lead to better communications, better teams, and awesome work. Thank you.